I want to give a very short synopsis of the story of Chanukah, because some of these things are not very well known, and in particular, the main source usually for what happened on Chanukah is this Masechet, what's called Megillat Ta'anit. There used to be a certain scroll which discussed the days when you're not allowed to fast. In the temple times, they used to have all kinds of minor holidays when you're not allowed to fast. And Chanukah was one of them, but there were a lot of other ones. Most of them eventually were lost. We don't celebrate them anymore. And in fact, the Talmud concludes that Batla Megillat Ta'anit, the whole laws of not fasting and not doing eulogies on certain days, this doesn't apply to us, because in our exile there are so many days. I mean, basically the whole year there were all kinds of terrible things that happened to our nation, so we cannot really remember every day that was used to be good, in some sense that something good happened, because so much bad happened since then, so much suffering pretty much on any day. So the only days that are still applicable are Chanukah and Purim. On those holidays you're still not allowed to fast, of course, and not allowed to do eulogies. So because of the mention of Chanukah and why this day is special, Megillat Ta'anit says basically a very short braita, a very short piece of braita is a very concise piece of oral law, similar to Mishnah, but outside of the Mishnah. Mishnah was what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi included in the main corpus of the Jewish law, and braitas are those that were not included. They usually start with the words Tanu Rabbanan or something similar. Our sages taught, and it says that basically the Yevanim, the Greeks, they're talking about Syrian Greeks. This was after Alexander the Great died, and his empire was divided between different parts of the empire became independent states, and one of them was today in part of Syria, another nearby countries, and it included a lot of times they ruled over the land of Israel. At other times it was the different part of the empire of Alexander, that was the Egyptian Greeks, Ptolemies. They also ruled over Judea during other years. So it's that was the main place where there were battles over control. Sometimes it was the Antiochuses, the Seleucid Empire, and sometimes it was the Greeks from Egypt. But in both cases, the nationality of most people was neither in Egypt nor in Syria was Greek. It's just their culture was Greek. Their rulers were from the highest warriors of Alexander the Great. So they're considered Greek. We call them Greek, and they were culturally Greek. But probably the more correct term would be Syrian Greeks. So it says that these Yevanim, the Greeks, were persecuting us, and they weren't allowing us to keep the mitzvot, and then the Hashmonaim were able to fight over them, and they came to the temple, and they found only a little bit of oil in order to be able to lit the menorah. They had just enough oil to lit for one day, and then it lasted for 8 days. So that's the main information that is in traditional Jewish sources. This braita is quoted in the Talmud, and that's about all we know about Chanukah if you only look in traditional sources. But of course, the story of Chanukah is far more complex than that. First of all, you might have a kind of impression that after the Chanukah miracle, after they were able to liberate the temple, that was it. The war was over, everything was just great, which was not true at all. For decades afterwards, the war continued. Just because they were able to liberate Jerusalem, part of Jerusalem, the temple, that doesn't mean that the war was over. They continued to fight the Syrian Greeks. Almost all of the children of sons of Matityahu died, not natural death. They all were killed by the enemy at various times. Only one of them that later, when things kind of settled after years and years of war, one of them, Shimon, the second son who lived the longest, he became kind of like a king. Chazal actually criticized him. He's not supposed to be king. The Kohanim, the priests, are not supposed to be kings. It's a separation of powers in a sense. But he became like a king. And he was also killed, but he wasn't killed by the Syrian Greeks. He was killed actually by his own son-in-law, whose name was also Ptolemy, by the way. His son-in-law, I guess, wanted to try to grab power, and he killed him. So that's how all the basically all the entire Hashmonai dynasty was very difficult. And later on, his son Yochanan Kohen Gadol, right, Yochanan Horkinus, was became the next kind of king, because this Ptolemy thankfully was not able to grab the power. So it was the son of Shimon ben Matityahu, that son became the leader, but he ultimately allied himself with the Tzedokim, with the Sadducees, and persecuted the sages at the end of his life. He became a proverbial figure of a person who was righteous all his life, and at the end of his life became wicked. And then later, his own son, Yanai, was even more wicked, as the Talmud concludes in Masechet Brachot, that he was Rasha Mi'ikaro. He was wicked for all his life, as opposed to Yochanan, who was wicked only at the end of his life. And then the two sons of Yanai were fighting over power, Horkinus and Aristobulus, and ultimately they brought in the Romans. Pompey was this Roman general, who became the arbiter of their fight, and that's how, as Rashi writes in Shir Hashirim, our nation became kind of a vassal of sorts to Romans, and Romans ultimately became more and more powerful and installed a king who was altogether not from the Jewish descent, was from Edomites, from Esav, from Edom. And that's was basically, all of this was the beginning of the end. So about 100 years later, the temple was destroyed, when the last king from the descendants of this Hordas, Herod, the last king, his name was Agrippa, was his own descendant, and ultimately the temple was destroyed, and most of our people were exiled. A lot of people still remained in the land of Israel after the destruction of the second temple, by the way. There was another revolt in the times of Bar Kokhba, some 50 plus years later, and that revolt was put down by Romans with even more cruelty, and even more people were killed or exiled. But still, the Jews continued to live in the land of Israel even after that, but there were already fewer of them, much fewer. And a lot of gezerot were then done against our people. At any rate, so the dynasty of Hashmonaim came in our history as both in the beginning as the people who fought guerrilla war and were very successful and fought for the Torah, for the mitzvot, but also as people whose descendants ended up actually persecuting sages and making alliances with nations that were hostile to us in the end, and ultimately bringing the destruction of our people. So that's why our sages had an ambivalent kind of attitude towards the Hashmonaim. We remember the good they did, but we also know from various sources, again, these are traditional sources I just quoted, Rashi and Shir Hashirim, of course there's writers in the Talmud, in Masechet Kiddushin, about how the descendants of Hashmonaim were persecuting our sages. All of these are traditional sources. But at any rate, as usual, the Talmud was not a historical book. It wasn't busy with history. We didn't have really any historians, except maybe Josephus, Joseph Flavius. So he wrote a history in Greek for the Greeks, for the Romans, but not really for the Jewish people. And so we didn't really have our own historians. What we have is these braitot here and there, something that Talmud mentions, something that some Midrash mentions, and that's why it's so hard to reconstruct Jewish history. Aside from the fact that some of these braitos also have Taut Sofrim, what's called, they sometimes have scribal errors, and sometimes there's dispute between sages themselves about Yanai, about Yochanan Kohen Gadol. There was even an opinion that it's all the same person apparently, but the other opinion, which is in fact correct, is that these are two different people, a son and a father. Whatever the case may be, I just wanted to read to you something I wrote years ago about the history of the Hanukkah miracle, which kind of summarizes the wars and what happened there. I think a lot of this information is not really well known because people just read what Rambam or Shulchan Aruch writes about Hanukkah, and rarely have access to the books of Maccabees, so-called, the books of Hashmonaim, right? There are a few such books, but two of them are the ones who tell us the main, at least, story, the historical story. At least, again, how reliable these books are is a big question, but generally speaking, for the most part, with maybe not looking at not paying too much attention to details. Generally speaking, the main story is based on these books can be relied upon. And Josephus, who was himself, by the way, a descendant of that family, I think. So he also writes, based on these books, a lot of this the history that I'm going to tell you today. So, of course, the Greek rule over the Jewish people started with Alexander the Great's conquest of our land, and his victory over Darius, the last Persian king. A lot of this, by the way, is hinted apparently in the Sefer Daniel, these stories. And to understand the exact chronology of these events, I want to mention that there's this counting, which our sages called shtarot, and the non-Jews call it Seleucid era. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right in English, but these are the Antiochuses that ruled over Syria. Those kings, the dynasty is called Seleucid, and that dynasty, their counting of years became very widespread. It was so accepted that, for instance, among Jews, Yemenite Jews, until basically less than 100 years ago, still used these counting. In a lot of old books, for instance, Rambam and other, you'll find usually two countings. And one of them is according to this era, the shtarot counting. So there was a small difference, less than a year, in different parts of the world. Meaning today, for instance, when people say, let's say the Christians say it's year 2024, they'll say it both in the East and in the West. It's the same way they count. But how historical this is a different question. It seems that the Christians themselves admit that the numbers they have is not necessarily correct. But at least it's uniform. Everybody agrees which year it is. But there was no agreement. There were basically, in the East and in the West, there were two ways from which day to count these years. So there was a difference of slightly less than a year between this counting. So for simplicity's sake, we'll say that the counting would be from year 312 BCE. So 312 before Common Era, that's when the year one, I guess, started for these shtarot. Now, one of the big advantages of this counting for Jews was it happened to be that, according to Seder Olam, the exodus from Egypt was exactly 1,000 years before that. So since thousands are rarely counted, usually when we say today is a certain year, we skip the thousands. Right? It's good enough if we know the hundreds, the tens. So for instance, now is year Tav Shin Pei He, 785. That's the Jewish year today. But really it's 5,785. But the thousands we usually skip. So here also, since when you skip the thousands, the years from Exodus would fit exactly to the years from this era. So that added to the fact that this counting was very much accepted by the Jews. When they would say, let's say, today is year, let's say 500, right? In let's say 2nd century of Christian era or something, right? They would say today is year 500. So they would really mean that it's 1,005, that it's year 500 by the counting of shtarot, and it's year 1,500 from the exodus from Egypt. So it's very comfortable to say that because the counting from exodus from Egypt was very common among Jews. A lot of the calendars and a lot of the counting would be from exodus from Egypt, the most important event in our history. So when the shtarot fit so well that it was just 1,000-year difference, it became very, very common. So in particular, the Talmud tells us that all the bills of divorce and other shtarot, other papers. Shtarot means papers. They were all using this kind of system. So Seder Olam gives us the following split, and that's mentioned in the Talmud also, that 180 years was the Greek rule, meaning from, I guess, beginning of that era until Hashmonaim 1, according to Seder Olam, past 100 years. And then for 103 years was the rule of the dynasty of Hashmonaim, and another 103 years was the rule of Herod and his descendants. So now the main events, right? The reason, by the way, I digressed into all these chronologies and counting is because the books of Hashmonaim give us all the chronologies according to this era, the Greek era. So the numbers, when you want to know which year it really was by us, you'd have to, if let's say you want to know how much it's going to be according to today's counting of Christian era, then you know that it starts from the year 312 or 311 BCE. So let's say if the events of Chanukah were 100 something years later, so they were in the 2nd century before Common Era and things like that. So once you know from which year to start, and you know the books of so-called Maccabees, whatever number they mention, you'll be able to know all the chronologies. I'm going to mention some of these numbers a little bit later. By the way, the fact that these books are called the books of Maccabees is also incorrect, because Maccabee was only a name of Yehuda. Really, they were not all called Maccabees. The Hashmonaim would be more correct term. The Maccabees is a term which sometimes Jews use also, but it's not really a correct term. Yehuda, his other name was Maccabee, and there are different opinions what exactly this means, but it's not that all of the descendants of Matityahu were called Maccabees. Anyway, so the main events that are happening during Hanukkah, of course, are under the so-called the king of Syrian Greeks. Was at that time somebody called Antiochus Epiphanes IV, meaning there were a lot of Antiochuses. This was the 4th one, and he was a very difficult person, and in particular, he's the one, under him all these decrees against the Jewish practice were made. The main revolt of the times of Hanukkah was not just an independence movement, but it was more based on the fact that the Greeks were not allowing us to keep the mitzvot. The Maccabees, the Hashmonaim, were people who were very religious, and the most important for them was to be able to keep Torah Judaism. So the revolt was mainly not just a regular independence revolution. It was mainly in order to uphold the religious observance. So there are different opinions what exactly made Antiochus Epiphanes IV make these decrees against the Jewish people. Why would he be different from the other kings? Generally, the Syrian Greeks were relatively tolerant towards Jewish observance, as long as we did not revolt against the king. It was the same actually with Romans. Most of the time when Romans used to persecute us, it was mostly because of not religious reasons, but because of political reasons. So for instance, after the revolt of Bar Kokhba, the Romans actually forbid us to keep the mitzvot, but this was again a political move, because Bar Kokhba was a very religious person, and the revolt was, the independence of the Jewish people was tied with the religious independence and this whole idea of Mashiach and being able to restore all the observance. So the Romans, of course, when they crushed the revolt of Bar Kokhba, they also forbid the observance of the mitzvot. But here we find the opposite situation. For some reason, Antiochus Epiphanes IV crushes down Jewish observance when there's no particular political advantage at that moment for it. Why not? I mean, what does he care what we believe in? So there are a few different theories offered what exactly happened over there. One of the views, actually, interestingly, is there was a historian in relatively recent times, 100 or so years ago, a little bit more, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi, and he wrote a book, a few volume book called Doras Harishonim, the early generations. And not far from me lived a rabbi who was very much He also wrote a few historical works and was very much fond of this Doros Harishonim, and he mainly based himself on this book, and that is Rav Avigdor Miller. So he wrote something very similar in one of his history books called Torah Nation. And that is that the main reason of the persecution, interestingly, was that it was the assimilated Jews who wanted the Greeks to help them assimilate the Jewish people. So it was something internal, very interesting, right? For instance, in the Soviet Union, after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was the Jewish section, so-called, it was the Jews who were anti-religious, who worked together with the Soviet government to crush the Jewish religion. Now, it's not like the Soviet government at the time was pro-religion. They were actually against every religion, Christianity also, Islam. They didn't care. They were trying to destroy every religion. But the Jews were persecuted the most at that time. And part of the problem was that there were these Jews who didn't want Jews to be religious. In fact, they perceived it as the main problem. Since the Jews are so different, that's why they hated. If the Jews would become part of the general society, right, and let all the workers unite kind of thing, if all the Jews would be similar to the non-religious Jews to the non-religious Russians, then we'll all just live happily and there will be no anti-Semitism. So this Jewish section fought against Jewish religion for that reason. And according to Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi and Rav Avigdor Miller, something similar happened in those times. That the assimilated Jews wanted everybody to abandon the Torah, to become more like the Greek society and accept the Greek culture. I mean, Torah includes culture too. It's not just a religion. Torah includes everything. So once the Jews will be more assimilated, they'll be more similar to the modern so-called Greeks. And that's why they were able to persuade, I guess they were powerful enough that they were able to persuade Antiochus Epiphanes IV to join into crushing the Jewish religion and forbidding the Jewish commandments. That's one possibility. There are other possibilities too, what happened there. But there could be more than one reason why this. He was a madman, by the way, this Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Even the Greeks describe him as a very difficult character. So at any rate, it probably wasn't very hard to make him persecute the Jewish religion. By the way, Rav Chaim Wasserman, a student of Chofetz Chaim, used to say that this is the main difference between Chanukah and Purim, that in Purim, Haman was a character similar to Hitler. He didn't care how religious Jews are. He would kill all the Jews, just like Hitler didn't care. And since he physically wanted to destroy us, so the mitzvot of Purim are all physical. To eat well, to give to others who are poor, to send gifts to friends. But on Hanukkah, it was spiritual death that these assimilationists wanted. So it wasn't against Jews per se, Jews as a nationality. It was against Jews as a religion. But if Jews wanted to become similar to Greeks, then nobody would touch them. So this was more similar to this Soviet type of persecution. And there, of course, since they were trying to do the persecution against our souls, not our bodies, that's why the commandments are all spiritual. On Hanukkah, the main commandments are to light the candles, to recite Hallel. They're all spiritual, not physical as in Purim. This idea already is brought in Levush, but Rav Chaim Wasserman develops it much to a greater extent. At any rate, the persecution of Greeks was already in full force, apparently, by the time of Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer. As the Midrash Rabbah mentions that the persecution already in his time. Maybe this is why it says in Pirkei Avot, right, there were two leaders at the time, two Yossis, Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer and Rabbi Yossi ben Yochanan. And one of the statements one of them made is, make your house into a house of study. Why would he say that, right? Because at that time they couldn't already study in Beit Midrash because the Jews were persecuted, so they did it clandestinely, right? They did secret studies in their own houses, in private houses. Similar to, of course, those Jews who remained loyal in the times of Bolsheviks, in the times after Russian Revolution, they used to study, making it look like they're doing something else, right? Maybe spread some newspapers, Pravda, right? Truth. The propaganda newspapers on the table, and under it is hidden a Jewish book that they're actually trying to read and things like that. By the way, this whole idea of dreidel on Hanukkah, some say, had to do with this too, that they would make it look like they're playing dreidel, and really were teaching Torah meanwhile, because teaching Torah was forbidden under penalty of death in those years. At any rate, so the Maccabees and Josephus tell us more or less the chronology of the events. So it started in year 145 of this era, which would make it into 167 before Common Era. So we're talking about 2,190 or so years ago, right? This is how long ago these events were happening. 2,190 something, right? So the aged Kohen Matityahu ben Yochanan refused to sacrifice a pig to a pagan god. That was what the Greeks were trying to force him to do. And this Matityahu, he himself didn't really live very long afterwards. He died within 1 year, after a year of the revolt. But his 5 sons continued the fighting. So 3 years after the beginning of this uprising was the time when they were able to enter the temple. At that time, it was Yehuda Maccabee. That's the one that we call Maccabee, like I said, in a second name of Yehuda, one of the 5 sons of Matityahu. He's the one who managed to liberate the temple, purify it from idols, resume the temple service. And at the same time, by the way, this Antiochus Epiphanes actually died. He died in the same year. But the war still continued for over 20 years. And one by one, the sons of Matityahu also perished at the hands of enemies, with only the second son, Shimon, who remained. And only in his time already, after the decades of fighting, did the relative peace start. Later on, by the way, the descendants of Hashmonaim became quite rich. And that maybe actually was one of the reasons that led to their downfall. But in those times, in the beginning, when the temple was recently purified, they didn't even have a golden menorah or even a silver menorah. They used to use a menorah that was made out of mostly of wood with iron branches or something like that, iron tops. Only later they were able to make a silver menorah and eventually a golden menorah. And similarly, it says in the Talmud that in those difficult times they didn't have enough wine to make Havdalah on the wine. So the Havdalah after Shabbat would be done only in Shmoneh Esrei, in prayers, but not on the wine. So this was a very difficult time in our history. In fact, Ibn Ezra thinks that the events of Hanukkah hinted at the end of Prophet Zechariah in the 9th chapter, where it compares the Redeemer to a poor man riding on a donkey. So a lot of people think it's talking about Mashiach, but Ibn Ezra thinks it's talking about those times. Imagine, the redemption of Hanukkah, when people are extremely poor and on the very low, but they were able to at least, for a time being, restore the observance. That was the main purpose of all of this. And as I said, unfortunately, it wasn't for a very long time. And on this, I'm going to end for today. And if you like this video, please press like.